Ladies and gentlemen, my name is Bill Brownfield, and I am your opening act for today's presentation. And I will speak for a few minutes by way of a scene setter for what we are going to discuss as this event goes on. Before I begin, I have one very personal comment to make to each and every one in this room. Yes, indeed, I am wearing my festive holiday tie. I am also wearing festive holiday socks. I do not care if none of you have the festive holiday spirit. As far as I'm concerned, after the first commercial appears on my TV screen for the holidays, I am entitled to wear my festive holiday clothing. It's not as though I get to wear it any other time in the year. Ladies and gentlemen, today's event is kind of positioned between two elections. One election that occurred on the 28th of July and a second election that occurred on the 5th of November. And I do want to set the scene for what those two events have produced and perhaps open some discussion in terms of where we should go from here. But I have to start my story well before the July 28th election of this year. I will start it in October of 2023 in the, I guess it's the Commonwealth of Barbados, where an agreement was concluded between some representatives of the democratic opposition of Venezuela and members of the Maduro government, and with the support and some might say encouragement up to and including pressure from representatives of Norway, the European Union, and the United States government. The agreement was, I would suggest, not a great agreement, but it did have one key element in it that proved to be quite important. It included a commitment by the Maduro government to permit free, fair, and open elections in the course of calendar year 2024. While there were some doubts, one person in the opposition movement said, "We'll take this agreement and run with it." A week later, in an open, free, fair, and transparent primary, she won, wait for it, 93% of the vote between, I believe, 6 candidates with fairly extensive turnout in Venezuela, particularly for a non-government sponsored primary. And after that election, after that primary was over, she, as the designated and elected representative of the democratic movement, committed the democratic movement to the what became the July 28th elections. It was not smooth to get to July 28th. In fact, the government of Mr. Maduro delayed many months before actually setting a date, but a date was set, and the date was set for the 28th of July. Were they going to be free, fair, and open elections? Of course not. Let's be realistic here. We're talking about Nicolás Maduro. He and those that reported to him disqualified the leading and elected candidate of the opposition, the designated substitute for that person. Several other candidates were disqualified for a variety of reasons, and eventually the democratic movement was required to reach out to an almost unknown candidate who was qualified, no doubt because the government thought he was no threat whatsoever, to become their candidate in the upcoming elections. Was there open access to the media of Venezuela? Not even remotely. Virtually all media that remains operational in Venezuela itself is either controlled by the government or significantly regulated by them, and the democratic opposition had almost no access to that media whatsoever, except in a confrontational or adversarial way. Were they allowed to campaign openly throughout the country? If you ignore the fact that many of their members were arrested, that there were constantly roadblocks that stood in the way of the opposition candidate actually getting to the cities and towns where they were to have their events and their movements. If you ignore the fact that there were practically counter demonstrations, paid individuals every single time, that Maria Corina Machado and Edmundo González would appear in a location. If you ignore all that, sure, you could say that they were open, free, and fair campaigns. That said, the election did take place on the 28th of July. And when the polls closed, the Democratic opposition, which had observers at virtually every polling site in Venezuela, was able to produce the signed tallies, signed by the actual junta, the board that was running that each individual voting site, with the results of the election. And by about 10 o'clock or 11 o'clock that night, they were in a position to say that the opposition candidate, former retired diplomat, so therefore a very important person, Edmundo González, had in fact won 67% of the vote, confirmed by 80% of the voting sites, which is to say it was mathematically impossible, even if you lost every single, even if the government candidate, Mr. Maduro, won every single remaining vote in the other 20%, he still lost the election to Mr. González. So everything's over, right? We've had a not free, not fair, not open election, but the Democratic opposition candidate has clearly won in a landslide, more than 2/3 of the votes. So we're moving to transition not so fast, as we all know, shortly after midnight on Election Day. The CNE, the National Elections Council, under control of the government of Nicolás Maduro, declares that no, Nicolás Maduro has won the election. He has won it with something like 54% of the vote. How do we know this? Well, we don't actually know, because to this day, the 20th of November, is it today the 20th of November? Yeah, 2024, the CNE of Venezuela has yet to offer the voting results from the individual polling sites. The only such data out there right now is from the Democratic opposition. So what happens, ladies and gentlemen, after the 28th of July? Well, to begin with, hundreds of thousands, probably in aggregate, millions of Venezuelan citizens, undoubtedly among the 67% that voted for Edmundo González, hit the streets in historic demonstrations protesting what is undoubtedly and unquestionably the theft, the stealing of an election by the sitting government. The international community, with 4 exceptions, which I'll name right now, Russia, China, Cuba, and Iran, the rest of the international community, should those that choose to comment on what happened in Venezuela, take a very clear position, saying that in fact, it is, at least until such time as the government can produce proof that they have won this election, that all of the evidence suggests that Edmundo González won more votes than did Nicolás Maduro. Some, many, I wish it would be everyone, but I am not the determiner on this matter, actually called him the president-elect. Others, such as the government for which I once worked for 39 years, refrained from making that determination, saying that they wanted to leave open the process of some sort of negotiated transition between the Democratic opposition and the Maduro government. The response by the government of Mr. Maduro was even simpler, and it can be described in one word: repression. More than 2,000 people arrested, ranging in age from about 13 to 85 or so. Roughly 40 people were killed while protesting on the streets. The message from Mr. Maduro was very clear, and that is, accept the result that my people announced, or you will go to jail, or worse, you will go to your tomb, your burial plot. Those are the only 2 options that he was leaving for the people. In the course of time, the gentleman who won the most votes in the election, facing extraordinary amounts of pressure, particularly to his family, has, as I presume we're all aware, pulled up stakes and moved to Spain, where he continues to operate and serve as the elected president-elect, if you will, of Venezuela. And the acknowledged head of the Democratic opposition, Maria Corina Machado, remains in Venezuela to this day. So, ladies and gentlemen, what are the key dates that we're looking at right now? And I hope we will talk about in the course of the next 30 minutes or so. I suggest there are two that will bookend the discussion. One is January 10th, 2025. The second one is January 20th, 2025. And what are these two dates? They are the dates for the inauguration of the new president of Venezuela, January 10th, and the inauguration of the next president of the United States on January 20th. We have an excellent panel to discuss this matter. It's especially excellent since, as I learned about 5 minutes ago, I am joining the panel as well, although I intend to speak as little as I can possibly get away with. I will leave it to the distinguished moderator in terms of what they will discuss and how they get there. I hope, Dr. Molina, that we will be able to discuss issues such as is the proper response by the international community a hard response or a soft response? Is it soft and fluffy, like let's continue to work for some sort of dialogue focused on something or other, or is it hard, such as sanctions and indictments, announcements of rewards offered for crimes committed, the old maximum pressure of the 2018 to 2021 timeframe? How does one deal with Nicolás Maduro? I mean, if most of the international community has said the gentleman did not win this election, how do you now deal with this individual after the 20th of January when he will claim to be the constitutional president of Venezuela? How do we deal with the two issues that the incoming president of the United States has made emphatically clear are high priorities for him? One is the question of migrants, and I would remind you that 7 to 8 million Venezuelan citizens are now refugees, migrants who have fled their country and spread around 40 to 50 countries in the world. The second issue is drugs, and those of you who have missed this over the last 20 years, the government of Venezuela has become, in a sense, an adjunct, a sucursal of the international drug trafficking organizations, in the sense that any individual in the Maduro government of any degree of seniority is in some way, shape, or form receiving revenue or support from the drug trafficking industry. If there is to be, if one wants to push the soft line, if you will, what is the incentive to get Mr. Maduro to sit down at the table and talk to the head of the Venezuelan opposition about transition to a new government and a new president? Do we recognize Edmundo González on the 10th of January as the elected constitutional president of Venezuela? I know I have a view on this, but this is something for the panel and for you to kick around. And finally, as I think through other things we might discuss, what about the idea of thumbing our nose at the distinguished gentleman down at Miraflores Palace in Caracas and pushing for a direct meeting that is made public and known to the world between, let's say, Donald J. Trump, the president-elect of Venezuela, and Maria Corina Machado, the head and leader of the democratic opposition and sector of Venezuela. Those are some ideas that I have, but nope, it is Dr. Molina who will make the final decision. Over to you, Doña Maria.
Thank you, Ambassador. Thank you, everybody, for being here with us. Also to everybody that is joining us on streaming. We know that many of you are also watching us from your offices and home, and we appreciate your presence in this panel. Many of you know Ambassador Brownfield. He was very well known in my country, Colombia, not only because of his preparation and his very good advice and good ideas, but because of his charm. And he was also always a person that was a pleasure to interview because of his personality. We are also joined here today by Mr. Carlos Vecchio, Ambassador Carlos Vecchio. Many of you know him too. Ambassador Vecchio is former ambassador of Venezuela to the US. He was appointed as ambassador of Venezuela in the year 2019. Many of you remember this year because it was the times of Juan Guaidó, who was elected president, recognized as president, but by a big portion of the international community. But he was never able to get into where he should be, which is the presidency of Venezuela at that time. Mr. Vecchio, as Ms. Maria Corina Machado, was also detained for hidden for 108 days in Venezuela. 108 days. After that, he was exiled, and he has been here in the U.S., and he has been a very important part of this opposition from Venezuela here in the United States. We are also with Ms. Ana Rosa Quintana. Ms. Ana Rosa Quintana is the Senior Policy Director for Vandenberg Coalition. She is, most recently, she served as the Staff Director for Western Hemisphere for House Foreign Affairs Committee Chairman Michael McCall. She's a Republican. She was the lead Republican advisor in the U.S. House of Representatives on U.S. policy towards Latin America and the Caribbean. So obviously, a very high-level expert on this topic. And my name is Maria. I'm Maria Molina. I'm a reporter, correspondent in Washington for Univision Network and for La FM de RCN Colombia. Thank you very much for being with us. And Merry Christmas, Ambassador. Well, I want to start this panel by talking about an interview that I'm sure we all read from Maria Corina Machado recently in the pages of the New York Times. She's hidden, as you were, Ambassador, at some point. And from there, she said that this is a great opportunity that the president-elect Donald Trump has to have a foreign affair victory in a very, very short term, as she described. And she called Donald Trump to press more criminal charges, to reimpose sanctions, to put more pressure on Nicolás Maduro. And she says that Nicolás Maduro right now is weak, so that this is the moment when this strategy would work. I would like to hear your opinion on this, Ambassador Vecchio.
You want to start now?
Or Ms. Ana Rosa, whoever.
How can I do this? Can you hear me well? Yes. Yeah, well, good morning. Thank you so much for this invitation to the Wilson Center. For me, it's an honor being here with Ambassador Brownfield and also with Anna. I mean, we have been working together for many years, and my pleasure being here. You know, I would say, you know, key messages for me for the new administration. One, we need to understand what the main objective should be, because otherwise, you know, they can get lost. And here is so clear. For me, I mean, the opposition won. Edmundo is the president-elect. And the only way to move forward is with a democratic transition inside of Venezuela. That should be the main objective. I mean, it's not the normalization with the regime. It's not like you know, trying to create another opportunity. No, the opportunities, the objectives must be that one. Second, and I agree with Maria Corina, what she said, for me, this is a unique political momentum in Venezuela. And I say this as a Venezuelan. I feel it in the DNA of the Venezuelan people. I mean, we won the election as never before. We haven't seen that in my country. And also, at the same time, we saw a stolen election by the regime as never before as well in Latin America. They wanted to impose what I call the napkin democracy. It's just reading the results in a napkin. I mean, that's unacceptable for us and, of course, for Latin Americans. So understanding that the big mistake of the dictator, of Maduro, and I call it mistake because it's coming from a dictator, it was allowing the election to take place. That was the big mistake of the dictator. The dictator doesn't do an election to lose it, but Maduro did it. And we prove it that we won. And that's the big mistake, because I have heard many people saying, well, you know, Ortega has been handling the situation in Nicaragua, so why Maduro cannot just do it? And I said to them, hey, one moment. Ortega did it, cleaned the house before the election, did the election, counted the votes, and, you know, it was illegal, it was undemocratic, but, you know, he supported that he won. Maduro didn't the other way around. The election took place, we counted the votes, and we won. And that political effect is impacting the situation right now in Venezuela. Everybody knows in Venezuela that Maduro lost the election. And to put it in a different manner, I would say that Maduro lost the authority to rule the country, even as a dictator, if I can say that expression. So the military officers, all the institutions in Venezuela, including the members of the Supreme Court, the CNE, all of them, and this is not a rumor, these are facts. They know that Maduro lost. So that's why I'm saying that this is a unique political momentum that we have, and we need to take advantage of that. So that's why I totally, share what Maria Corina said. Third point that I want to make, just closing 2 more, and I'm over. So having that in context, the momentum for the pressure is now. It's not tomorrow. It's not in 3 months. It's now. Otherwise, we will lose the tensions that we have created through the electoral process that took place in July 28th. Losing that momentum, for me, will be a big mistake. It will be a big mistake. So the momentum to put all the pressure is now. Third, I call it a smart pressure. That's the way it should be called. I have heard many times the international community saying, well, we need to apply this, well, probably this one, this mechanism now. I mean, setting dilemmas that for me is a big mistake. I mean, the international community, and particularly the United States, they have to use all the tools available to create pressure on the Maduro regime. All the tools available at once. There is no silver bullet from the international community to deal with, let's say, the case of the dictatorship in Venezuela. There is no silver bullet. How about if I apply this sanction or the other one? No, you have to use all of them now because the context, as I said, is now. When I'm saying all the tools, I'm referring to diplomatic pressure, sectoral sanctions, secondary sanctions, sanctions to national and foreign enablers, including inner circles and countries who are supporting Maduro, visa restriction, and this one, the last one that in my view is quite important, a law enforcement approach that we haven't seen enough, particularly when you are dealing with a regime which is a criminal organization in power. And the last point that I want to make in this first intervention is that the new administration needs to give all the support to Maria Corina and to Edmundo as a president-elect. The engagement has to be with them. They are the leader of this movement. Supporting them, backing them, and giving them legitimacy will facilitate the main objective, which is a democratic transition in Venezuela.
So this is the vision from the Venezuela opposition. Now we all want to hear, what do you, Mrs. Quintana, think about this? Is this momentum, as Ambassador Vecchio said, a good opportunity for the new president to take advantage and make a change in Venezuela?
Sure, Maria. So I'm looking at this, right, kind of as an American and as somebody who used to advise policymakers, right, on what could potentially be the future policy, right? None of us have a crystal ball in front of us. Nobody knows exactly what's going to happen. But what I would do is kind of like offer folks to look at it this way, right? Make a Venn diagram and look at what are the threats that Venezuela under Nicolás Maduro poses to the United States. What are the key priorities of the incoming Trump administration, right? So you have migration, you have drugs, you have foreign adversaries, and you also have the issue of American hostages. And that's something that, frankly, and I say this as an American citizen and somebody who used to advocate very strongly for American hostages and meet with the families, does not get discussed enough. And so you kind of combine all of that. And that is essentially what the Trump administration wants to tackle and fix on behalf of American citizens, right? The migration front, much like every other country in the region, the United States is now being strongly impacted by the criminal element of the Venezuelan migration exodus, right? On the drugs, I mean, this is something that Ambassador Brownfield, you are a complete expert on, but all of us have now seen. There is a spike of drugs now coming from Venezuela through the Caribbean into the United States. Mm-hmm. We're all talking about the fentanyl crisis, but America still has a serious cocaine epidemic. Cocaine overdoses are still a significant problem here. And then we also talk about foreign adversaries, right? Russia, China, Iran, Cuba. And I think I wouldn't put adversary into this, but I would put country that's being not so helpful in this mix is also Colombia in that sense. And so if you kind of just look at the constellation of the context and what we're dealing with here and what the Trump administration, what the president-elect wants to tackle on behalf of the American people, I mean, it's very clear cut that there is going to be a strong approach taken towards foreign adversaries and towards countries that are undermining American interests. And so I think we should all kind of take a step back and be kind of assured that regardless of what modem or what kind of how it's operationalized, something positive will come of this.
Ambassador Brownfield, Ambassador Vecchio says that Maduro made a mistake. I'm really interested in that and the way that took Maduro to make this mistake, and also some of his allies, for example, Brazil, President of Brazil, Lula da Silva, or Gustavo Petro from Colombia, are not even recognizing those elections. Is this an evidence that Maduro right now is more weak than ever, as Maria Corina says?
Yep. I mean, Maria, I do not understand how anyone in the world could argue that Nicolás Maduro today is weaker in a political sense than he was before the July 28th elections. Mm-hmm. Before the July 28th elections, he was able to control, in a sense, in a non-democratic manner, but able to control both the direction in which Venezuela moved, but also kind of the public perception of government. He now has lost something. Is he weaker than he was before the election? Yes, he was. And this is what I acknowledge to many of my former colleagues in the Department of State and those who worked for the current administration. I grudgingly acknowledge, yes, this election process, which in my opinion, the Barbados Agreement gave away too much to Mr. Maduro in exchange for too little that we received. But, which is what happens sometimes, when the United States government chooses to negotiate on behalf of the Democratic opposition rather than allowing the Democratic opposition to negotiate for itself. That said, I do acknowledge that the election has had an impact on Nicolás Maduro. Now, is it enough, Maria, to say he's teetering? He's going to collapse. The inevitable, what do you call it? The tipping point has arrived, and it's all downhill for him right now. I'm not prepared to say that because, in a sense, I believe that what should be done, exactly as the Democratic opposition leader has suggested, is pack on the pressure. Carlos is calling it, is it smart?
Smart pressure.
Smart pressure. In my day, when I was in Venezuela, 2004 to 2007, 3 of the longest years of my life, I coined the expression in confidential conversations within the United States government and I called it smart confrontation. And I thought it was a clever way to see it. Of course we want to confront, but we don't want to be stupid about how we do it. We don't want to fall into any trap that the late Hugo Chavez Frias, que en paz descanse, and his acolyte Nicolás Maduro might lay, but find ways to confront, find ways to encourage them to make mistakes. It does not mean that we have to have a game plan of 16 different points, and once we have accomplished each of those 16, we have automatically produced a democratic outcome for Venezuela. It's not going to work that way any more, Maria, than it worked in past years and decades. Let's say when Nelson Mandela was offering opposition in South Africa to the apartheid governments of South Africa. In Poland, when Lech Walesa was basically leading a labor movement that opposed an authoritarian, totalitarian government in Poland, any more than it did in the Philippines when Cory Aquino basically said, right, we are now going to create an opposition to Fernando Marcos, but she didn't have a game plan as to how to bring it to successful conclusion. I mean, this lady's, well, let's come in closer. Violeta Chamorro, when she finally said, enough in Nicaragua, but she did not have a game plan. What she was a permanent opposition to this government with an alternative message. And eventually, at some point in time, which no one ever predicted correctly, when all the pieces were in proper alignment, it led to the departure of the authoritarian, totalitarian government. That, from my perspective, is the direction from which we should be taking. I'll call it smart confrontation again, simply because it sounds cooler than smart pressure. Pressure, it's not enough syllables there. Confrontation, you can get a practically sentence worth in smart confrontation, and I'll continue to say it because I believe this is the way to go. Don't let people force you into defending ridiculous things that would automatically turn the people of the hemisphere, not to mention the people of Venezuela, against us. Find ways to deliver the message, to deliver the pressure in a way that keeps Mr. Maduro, a man who's quite capable of making mistakes. We just saw that, by the way, on July 28th, 2024. There's nothing magical about the gentleman. He's kind of like a human, and humans do make mistakes.
And right now from Venezuela, after this mistake, Nicolás Maduro is raising a flag, a white flag, and saying, President-elect Donald Trump, let's talk. He's trying to have an open dialogue. He is calling for a situation in which there can be a win-win situation, win for Venezuela, win for Nicolás Maduro, not Venezuela, and win for Donald Trump. How do you think the Trump administration should receive these messages? Also, the fact that they released some prisoners that should have never been there, but still were prisoners.
I mean, I think, what Maduro is trying to do is what he did back in 2016. I mean, they send the same messages. Actually, they pay for a stage in the inauguration day for Trump. But I mean, they know who they are. They are releasing some political prisoners, yes, but they are putting another ones. And something that I have seen in my country that I didn't see it in the past, I used to see only the revolving doors for Venezuelans, and now there is a revolving doors for Americans. For Americans. There is no respect for the regime, for the United States, and it has to be considered. They have been detaining Americans, they have been releasing Americans, and now they have, again, other Americans in prison. So I think the new administration knows the real nature of this regime and what they did. And I think the administration, in my view, has sent a clear message with the recent appointments. Because something that, Maduro wants to sell is that, well, to the people inside of Venezuela is that, what Trump wants is to control the migration. We are the only one who can receive the Venezuelans here, and that's it. Business as usual. I don't see it that way. Again, the message sent by the administration with the new nomination is clear for me, at least. Secretary of State Rubio, Senator Rubio, I mean, he knows Latin America, he knows the actor, he knows the challenges, and he knows also the dictators, including Maduro. And also the National Security Advisor, Waltz, Congressman Waltz, I know Congressman Waltz, he's from Florida as well. He knows everything about Venezuela. Yesterday was approved a legislation to put more pressure on the Maduro regime, but in my view, this legislation is important, but it's not the key element for me. The sponsor of that law was Waltz. He will be in the White House in 2 months, and he sent yesterday a clear message that it won't be a tolerance to Maduro. So what I'm expecting is what I said. They know the nature, and they know that this type of regime only understands through a smart confrontation, to use the word of my colleague ambassador. And just to make a comment on migration. Trump administration, and particularly President Trump, has said that Maduro had been sending people here, as a way to manipulate and get some political benefits. So if somebody sends you people to the border with Mexico, if you send some flights, are you going to trust the regime, that they won't keep sending people to the border to keep the same, leverage, or at least to try to get some political benefits? Yes, they will do. It won't be enough, okay? So I think the Trump administration understands that the only way to stop, the migration coming out of Venezuela is with a political transition. Would be the only way to stop the crisis that we have seen in the region, but particularly in the border with Mexico.
Migration, very important issue in this. Mrs. Quintana, after January 20, Donald Trump is going to be in the White House. The Republican Party is going to have the majority of the Senate, the House. It's a very, very powerful Republican Party. How are you seeing that your colleagues, your fellows in the Republican Party are receiving these messages from Nicolás Maduro? And how do you think the Republican Party should handle this situation moving forward?
Sure. So, I think Ambassador Vecchio brought up something that I very much want to thank him for, and that's bringing up the issue of American hostages, because, again, frankly, that's not brought up enough. Americans are constantly bringing up the issue of Venezuelan political prisoners, so thank you, and I would encourage our other Venezuelan friends to advocate on their behalf as well. And I think, to answer your question, Maria, it's kind of dovetailing off the point that Carlos brought up. It's, I would not be concerned about the Trump administration falling into some sort of trap laid out by the Maduro regime on reaching some sort of accord on migration or whatnot, right? I mean, we all have to remember that a negotiated solution to the problems in Venezuela has always been the strategic objective of both the Trump administration 1.0, of the Biden administration, except the big difference is the Trump administration, and I would argue Republicans, have been far more clear-headed in terms of the intentions and the capabilities and the true nature of our adversaries, right? We're not going to fall into this trap that's saying, oh, just because I had a private meeting in Qatar with some unnamed official from the Venezuelan regime and I was promised X, Y, and Z, that I can all of a sudden, unilaterally push the U.S. government to unilaterally lift sanctions. And I think, kind of to answer your question, we can expect to see that from the Republican Party moving forward, right? I mean, managing the issue of kind of the crises across the world that the Biden administration is leaving for Republicans to clean up, whether it's in Ukraine, whether it's going to be preventing a war in the South China Sea, or, the problem with our adversaries in the region. It's all going to be done from a position of strength and from a position of knowing that the past 4 years of, taking kind of like a unilaterally appeasement approach has not worked, right? So we have to come in strong, and you have to come, and the great thing is that Republicans have a mandate, right? Republicans have the mandate to act, and that's what the American people want to see. And so I'm very optimistic, and I don't necessarily think just because Maduro is out there waving a white flag and claiming that he wants to negotiate. Of course he wants to negotiate. He's always wanted to negotiate. Now, let's see what form that negotiation takes. It's definitely not going to be easy on him, that's for sure.
Ambassador Brownfield and also Secretary Blinken yesterday stated that finally, that Edmundo González was the winner of these elections. Why now? What effect does this have on this whole issue?
Yeah, I do agree. It took a very long time to get to this point, but that's water under the bridge now. The why now, I suppose, is because this makes the United States inevitably going to have to say on the 10th of January that Edmundo González is now the constitutional president of Venezuela, assuming, as I do, that Edmundo González will proceed with some sort of process by which he is sworn into office, wherever that may occur. And that is of some value, I suppose. But may I tell you, Maria, what keeps me awake at night, I suppose, is I think through the incoming administration. And in fact, I think the good Dr. Quintero is absolutely right. I don't think it's going to happen, but I suspect there are people who are trying within, say, the large body politic that want to claim that they are in some way affiliated with the incoming president-elect, who are arguing that it's time to take up the Maduro offer and produce a very big and quick victory. And it would be open up oil and gas to the United States again, get the agreement of Nicolás Maduro to accept the return of thousands, probably tens of thousands of his citizens to Venezuela, who are in fact will be exported, if you will, expelled from the United States because they're here without proper documentation, and release all of the American prisoners. Now, what's wrong with that? One, we don't need Venezuelan oil and gas. Second, it's of such a minimal amount right now that it has no impact whatsoever. To the extent there's any additional oil and gas from Venezuela, it will be the extent to which U.S. companies invest their own resources in terms of delivering it. It has no real impact, certainly on the United States economy and the United States oil and gas industry. Migrants, first, there's something kind of inherently repulsive about having to negotiate with a government and a president to do what he is by international law required to do anyway. Every government must accept the return of its own citizens. It's not like you can say, all right, well, we don't like that 20 million. We've kind of gone through this a number of times before we started it. I mean, we've gone through it in the pogroms of the late 19th and early 20th centuries. In Eastern Europe and the Russian Empire. We went through it at the end of the Second World War. I mean, yes, there is right of return. Born and raised in this country, you get to go back to this country. And this is nothing you need to pay a price for to get them to say, yes, I'll accept them. And it does not address the fundamental underlying problem, which is why are nearly 8 million Venezuelans 25% of the national population, why have they fled their own country? And if your only deal is, here's a smoother way to send many of them back, all that's going to happen is it's just going to be a circular issue. They'll go back, but they'll hit the road again for the same reasons that they left to begin with. And the prisoners, may I tell you, Maria, back when you and I were doing great things in Colombia. You were, of course, barely out of grade school at this time, but I was there from 2007 to 2010. And one of my most important missions was to get 3 U.S. citizens who had been held hostage by the FARC guerrillas. When I arrived, it had been for 4.5 years, and to get them out of their cages in the Colombian jungle. And these were guys who had actually been working for the U.S. Embassy at the time their plane went down. And may I tell you, we worked this problem set for 5.5 years. Could we have cut a deal with the FARC guerrillas and gotten them out probably in a matter of a month? Yeah, there were 3 or 4 senior FARC people that were in U.S. penitentiaries for drug-related and other charges, and probably we could have cut a deal almost immediately. What would have happened? I'll tell you what would have happened. Within 2 months, another 3 American citizens would have been grabbed by the FARC and held in the pokey. Why? Because the FARC would have realized this is a way this is leverage to get what we want from the U.S. government. This is exactly what Mr. Maduro is doing. What a stunning surprise that after the release of, I think it was 6, after the Barbados Agreement, was it 8, whatever the number, 10, that they're got that, and that's fine. I am delighted for them and for their families. There's now another half dozen or so that have been picked up. And what is Maduro doing? He's holding these for the next kind of deal that he can cut with the U.S. We have to have something that's a bit more sophisticated than we'll just do a swap every time you grab some of our citizens. Could I cut this sort of deal with Maduro on behalf of the president-elect? Yeah, I could do it in about an hour. Give Maduro what he wants, and sure, that's a piece of cake. I kind of think that's what we did when we normalized relations with the Cuban government back in the Obama administration. Nothing succeeds like giving in to the other side. But my view is there's a better way to proceed, and I bet the distinguished lady whose face has just appeared on a screen to my left would agree with me, even though she may not be listening.
Well, you'll see her. She's Maria Corina Machado. She's called the Iron Lady. In that interview that I started this panel with, she was saying that she needs a hug. She hasn't seen anybody for a long time. Nobody knows where she is, but there she is fighting for democracy in her country. Ms. Maria Corina Machado, let us send you a big, respectful hug wherever you are. Welcome to this panel, and we're very happy to see you.
Thank you so much. I am thrilled to be sharing these moments with you. All of you are good friends of the Venezuelan cause for freedom and democracy, and very grateful to the Wilson Center, to the Iván Duque Center for Prosperity and Freedom. Of course, a pleasure to share these moments with our good friend, Ambassador William Bromfield, Thank you, Ana Rosa, Quintana, Carlos Vecchio, and of course, you, Maria, for your moderation. And I'm sure you have had a passionate discussion. I think we are living critical and decisive moments for Venezuela, and I'm convinced that we've never had an opportunity such as the one we're facing right now. And I say this because after 25 years of struggling against a tyranny that has gotten more and more destructive, I believe that we are in a point never reached before in which all interests of different stakeholders are aligned around a peaceful transition in Venezuela. And above this, or in addition to this, I think Maduro is in its weakest position ever. First of all, because they have totally lost any, rest of legitimacy. And this is something that they did have to care about. If not, they wouldn't have had over 30 elections in 25 years. But what happened on July 28th, under the rules of the tyranny, was something they never expected. We not only won by a landslide, 70-30, but we were able to prove that victory in less than 24 hours. So this is huge, and Maduro's reaction with unleashing this brutal campaign of terror and repression has only further sink them in terms of international isolation. Secondly, we've never had an opposition united or as united as the one we have right now. It goes beyond political parties. Different groups of civil society that have been joining before the primaries, after the primaries, and before the election, and even after the election. Third, we have a legitimate leadership that was elected on October 22nd of last year in the primary process, and of course, Edmundo González just recognized as president-elect by the U.S. government, and that we maintain, and I have to say this, a united team in terms of making this coalition move forward and grow. And I would say that in the international arena, we've seen a very wide coalition growing. Just in Latin America, you have from Gabriel Boric, Chile's president, to Javier Milei, supporting our cause, as it has been also a bipartisan cause in the US Congress. And the last issue I want to mention regarding the regime's unquestionable weakness and fragility is the more and more evident tensions, and I would say even fractures among the system that it's in power right now. And many of these are public and most are not, but this certainly reaches sectors that have been historically Maduro's biggest pillars of support. I'm talking about the armed forces, the judiciary system, and even corruption networks and fragment that start to understand that this system is not sustainable from a financial perspective, from a political perspective, and certainly from a human social perspective. So I believe we are facing a huge opportunity, not only for Venezuelans, because this fight for us is existential, but certainly for the region, for democracies in the Western Hemisphere, and especially for the United States of America. And I think it's obvious, but I think it is important that I insist on what it would mean if Maduro prolongs this tragedy for several months. And there are obvious consequences. One of them would be a new wave of migration. There are at least 30% of Venezuelan society that says it would leave very soon, in perhaps a year. You could see 2, 3, 4 million Venezuelans crossing borders. These would have certain and further political destabilization process in the region. We would see a surge in drug trafficking and other illegal activities if Maduro stays, increased support for terrorist and extremist organizations, and certainly even more penetration of organized criminal groups and gangs in countries in this continent. On the contrary, if we manage to move forward in an orderly, peaceful transition, we will see the opposite results. I believe that in a matter of months, we will see not only migration declining dramatically, but we will see hundreds of thousands of Venezuelans coming back home. We need to go to the cause of the problem and not only the consequences. And the cost of migration is the lack of future. It's not only economic trouble, it's the lack of future. And Venezuelans know clearly the only way we can have a future in the country if we have a regime change. Secondly, we will work closely with the US government and agencies and other governments in dismantling the criminal networks that have found a safe haven in Venezuela. I also believe that from a political perspective, we will see consequences in the short term in other dictatorships in the region, Cuba, Nicaragua. They today need desperately Venezuelan support. It's not the other way around anymore. I think we will see certainly cutting complex and dangerous liaisons with other enemies of the United States, such as Iran, Syria, Belarus, and Russia. And finally, we will see an unstoppable process of strengthening, of growth, of not only economic growth, but institutional growth, democratic growth, human growth in Venezuela. And we will open markets, we will have rule of law, and we will have a huge opportunity to take advantage of Venezuela's potential in the energy sector. Not only oil and gas, but also renewable. So in short, we will be able to turn Venezuela, transform Venezuela from the criminal hub of the Americas into the energy hub of the Americas and a true ally of democratic societies. So this is a moment to act. We do have an opportunity, less than 50 days. Edmundo González should be sworn in as president, constitutional president of Venezuela. We have a mandate, we have the strength, we have the will of the people, and we need the support of the international community that understands that this is a unique opportunity that we cannot let pass. We will prevail, and I know that Venezuela will be a free country to which we will bring our kids back home. Thank you very much.
Well, hopefully the next time that we see you, Ms. Maria Corina Machado, is not there on Zoom. Hopefully we can have you in Washington at some point and democracy returns to your country. Thank you for being with us. I know we would like to talk about this topic for much longer. Unfortunately, the time is over, but I also think that by this point, there is enough evidence for all of us to agree that there was a winner in the elections in Venezuela, and it was not Nicolás Maduro. Hopefully, the international community has a reaction to this. Hopefully, the new administration, as Ms. Maria Corina Machado calls, can have enough actions to make a change. And of course, the Republican Party now has a great opportunity. Mrs. Quintana, you're inside there. I'm sure that this conversation is going on, and hopefully this will bring some change to the situation. We need to close this panel. Thank you very much, Ms. Ana Rosa Quintano, for being here with us. Mr. Carlos Vecchio, Ambassador of Venezuela, former ambassador, but always ambassador, as you know. And Mr. Ambassador, Mr. Bromfield. Thank you so much for being today with us at the Wilson Center, and thank you all for joining us, and thanks to the Wilson Center for this invitation. Yes.